What does it mean to be left-wing or right-wing? What's the hard left and the alt-right? Who knows? Who cares? Well, some people care, and some people really care. But why? Why does it seem so important to some people where exactly they, or more usually others, are placed on the whole left-right spectrum? Speaking from an economic perspective, which, as far as I'm concerned, is the only way of viewing the spectrum, I consider myself to be currently, since it changes, slightly left of centre. The reason for this is that I believe in and support certain things that are part and parcel of a liberal, socially democratic state. The National Health Service, for instance, or socialised medicine if you prefer, universal education, a well-funded military. I think all of these things, and some others, ought to be paid for by everyone in the form of taxation. I don't believe in, and nor do I support, private schools, faith schools, and private medicine as a point of principle. And as a point of practicality, I don't believe in privately owned nuclear power stations or railways. So far, so left. However, I do believe that these things need to be paid for, and it seems as if the best way of doing that is by harnessing the profit motive in the form of enterprising capitalism. I also believe that capitalism, when it works, has a tremendous ability to improve prosperity. At its very best, it seems it can generate money almost out of thin air. And socialism can't do that, that's for sure. So, am I now back on the right? I say again, who knows? And who cares? One thing that I definitely do not do is profess my loyalty to either the Conservatives on the right or the Labour Party on the left. And why would I? For they don't deserve my loyalty. All that either side can count on is me disliking the other side more at the time. When the Conservatives allow the economy to overheat, whilst they are busy ensuring that their friends make fortunes in the city, why would I be loyal to that? Similarly, if the Labour Party are squandering my money on surveillance systems to keep the law-abiding public under their control and using the taxpayer-funded police force to search for mean words on Twitter, rather than actually arresting properly mean gangs of paedophiles, why would I give them my allegiance? It doesn't make any sense, let alone any principle. So this left-right dichotomy is unhelpful at best and dilutes any clear thinking at worst. In fact, some of it is quite comical. For instance, the strange spectacle of people being horrified that the leader of the Labour Party might actually be a socialist of all things. Of course, labels are useful in making sense of the competing opinions that are flying around. Sometimes you have to speak in broad terms. If you don't, you're left with an alphabet soup of mild to wildly differing philosophies. Capitalism, corporatism, anarcho-capitalism, anarchism, plutocracy, socialism, communism, Marxism, Marxist-Leninism, anarcho-socialism, fascism, Maoism, Nazism. Some of these terms are thrown about around willy-nilly, others less so. But this focus on left versus right often tells us nothing, sometimes even less than nothing. Nazism stood for nationalism and socialism. Was Hitler socialist? Well, kind of, but mostly he was a totalitarian nutcase, whatever else he might have been. But you certainly don't get many on the left claiming him as one of theirs. Similarly, George Orwell is a hero to those who believe in free speech, but he was a socialist, and most on the right was claiming him as one of theirs, mostly just skim over that fact. But again, socialist or not, he was mostly a champion of a free society. At least some people, when they talk of such things, at least they go to the trouble of defining what they mean. Jordan Peterson, when he talks of cultural Marxists, explains that the supposedly culturally oppressed, blacks, women, gays, lesbians, trans people, and broadly anyone in the West who is not white, male, middle class and heterosexual, have been conveniently slotted into the place once occupied by the, in many cases, the actually economically oppressed of all war's time. At least he defines what he's talking about, which is useful, since it specifies, as far as is possible, who his political opponents are. So it seems to be purely right-wing, I must support capitalism, which is fair enough. I must also support free trade, which of course all good capitalists support. And I must support President Trump, because he's right-wing, isn't he? But then he's supporting trade barriers, isn't he? And he's also the architect of the proposed wall on the United States-Mexico border in order to prevent mass immigration into the US. But then doesn't pure capitalist economics favour open borders in order to allow the unfettered free market to operate at maximum efficiency? So how does that square with capitalism? Is Trump a secret commie? No, but again we have to look at what he mostly is, which as far as I can tell is Donald J. Trump. In fact, I would go as far as saying that in the case of Trump, that's about all he is. A lot of people say that he is a racist. I don't think that he is. Not because I believe him to be a person of high moral virtue. I don't. But I believe that he is more than capable of using the public's perception of him as a racist in order to advance the cause of Donald J. Trump. If it got him more votes, I wouldn't be at all surprised to see him in either a KKK outfit or sharing a platform with the Nation of Islam. There's a similar muddle back home. If you're for Brexit, you must be right-wing. And racist, don't forget. But then, once again, Brexiteers are not for open borders, which is a capitalist policy, for the reasons I've already mentioned. So Brexit supporters are left-wing then? Well, yes and no, and sometimes, and a bit, and not really. These labels tell us almost nothing. But what they do tell us is something about the person who is calling you right-wing, in the case of the left-winger. They tell us that they think they're better than you. The phenomenon that we now all know as virtue signalling was long overdue, and until somebody coined that phrase, it was a pretty successful tactic by the left to shut the conversation down. You're a bad person because you think this. I think the opposite, ergo, I'm a good person, so you must listen to me. But there's an old adage which is relevant here. Sometimes you have to be cruel to be kind. The thing about old adages is that they exist for a reason. There's a truth to them. Take European immigration policy, for instance. The Mediterranean is chock full of leaky, unseaworthy and downright dangerous vessels that are themselves chock full of thousands upon thousands of supposedly undocumented migrants seeking a better life in comparatively rich Europe. The virtual signalling left call them refugees, and the mean-spirited and probably racist, remember, right, call them economic migrants. So what's to be done? Well, the knee-jerk reaction is to be humanitarian, and it's understandable. Who wouldn't want to help those in distress? I would, if I was there. Of course I would. It's the same impulse all over the civilised world, when 20,000 people patiently sit in a traffic jam, all to save one life. But what happens when the unquestionably admirable desire to help kicks in and alleviates the suffering? More boats come, filled with even more people, in even less seaworthy craft, and despite the best efforts of the Italian, Spanish and Greek coastguards, more people die as a result. That approach is quite literally killing with kindness. And this is virtual signalling writ large, and it says more about the rescuers than the rescued, more about the white knights than the victims. You could go as far as to say, I don't, but you could go as far as to say, who cares about the victims so long as our consciences are safe? So practically, this approach is not working, and it's actually making things worse. But let's explore the morality of this issue a little more. Being a European, and I mean geographically rather than an EU citizen in this case, so I'm including the British, is an unearned privilege for almost all of us. We never chose to be born here. It was never our decision and was nothing really to do with us. There's been a lot of talk about certain types of privilege, mostly white, in recent years, but probably not enough about European or North American, Australasian or Japanese privilege. We can take no credit for the enormous stroke of luck that life has dealt us in being born on the northern side of the Mediterranean. Our parents can't take much either, but they can take a little more than us. Likewise, our grandparents can take a little more than them, and each generation can take a little more credit than the last for the peaceful and prosperous continent that we were blessed to be born into. So goes the argument and the rationale for being humanitarian. We are just lucky, and they're not. Therefore, we must help them. And that's a fair argument, and one I have sympathy with. But imagine you have kids. Perhaps you do have kids. And as part of your duty of care to them, you decide to start ferreting money away for them in the form of a trust fund that they can benefit from once they are of a certain age. This happens all over and is considered a reasonable and even a moral thing to do. But just imagine that, just as they are about to turn 18, a group of children that have been abandoned by their parents turn up on your doorstep. Do you then start delving into your kid's legacy in order to help these other kids? No? Why not? After all, it's not their fault. And let's be honest, your own kids have done nothing to deserve the windfall that you're going to bestow upon them. Why do they get it when these other urchins do not? Surely that's unfair, isn't it? But our societies, our rich and peaceful societies that we have spent generations building, are our legacy to our children, to our next generation. We haven't spent centuries striving to make our societies better, just so that the children of others, in this case other countries, can come along and partake of our riches. Does that sound harsh? Maybe it does. Selfish, probably. But practical? I reckon it is. It's understandable, and not to say admirable, that people wish to improve their lives. But you can't solve North Africa's problems by emptying it of people. Africa must be made better. It mustn't be abandoned. I know that a lot of people coming to Europe are genuinely fleeing war and persecution, but most aren't. I'll admit I was fooled by the Arab Spring, along with a lot of others, including David Cameron, and like him, in my own small way, I bear some guilt in supporting the toppling of Gaddafi, which unfortunately resulted not in a flourishing of tolerant democracy, as I had hoped, but in Libya becoming the most failed of failed states. Europe must not be turned into Africa. Africa must be turned into Europe. And that really is being cruel to be kind. So there is an assumption that to be kind is to be better than being unkind. even if, by being kind, you make the situation worse. But surely to be unkind, but effective, has got to be better than to be merely kind. The kind people, or the left, if you must, it seems, will prefer that desperate Africans die in the caring arms of humanitarian Europeans, rather than that they instead might survive and flourish. So as far as I'm concerned, it's not about left or right, since those are slippery concepts at the best of times, but about those who think they are better than others, and those who know they are not.